here live on YouTube with Matt Snyder and Jesse Herring.
Hello.
And thank you guys for being on the Nowman show. They are the creators and the producers and performers, I guess you could say, of the podcast, The Future Is A Mixtape. Yeah. So on your website, you have that it's a podcast that hopes to move away from the postmodern and morbid condition of constantly poking at the corpse of capitalism and our dystopian landscape, and instead aims to open up discussion on actual solutions to the overwhelming problems facing our dying Earth.
Boy, aren't there some overwhelming
Oh
problems.
my gosh.
Tremendous.
Well, so we can get to know you guys a little bit first, because we got a lot to talk about. Matt, now you are involved in education?
Yeah, I teach at the University of California at Riverside. I teach in the university writing program, which is a separate program / department that does composition, rhetoric, argumentation.
Oh, that's fantastic.
But my degree, my PhD is actually at the English department at UCR. So,
oh, wow.
so I actually was hired within the university, which is unusual.
Yeah, so it's your alma mater. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So now, Jesse, you're from California.
Yeah. Well, I'm
Actually,
originally from Pacific Northwest, but I was born in Whittier, California.
Oh.
And then my family moved because they wanted to actually be able to afford a house, because even then owning a house was something that was hard to do in LA. So we moved up to the Pacific Northwest, and then I went to school at Western Washington University where I met Jesse.
Oh.
And then I went to grad school at UC Riverside.
Oh, I see.
And then just have now been here literally for 17 years. So,
oh, wow.
So I've yet to visit the hospital where I was born, but I've been told I was born in Whittier, California.
Oh, wow. That's Richard Nixon's hometown.
Oh, yeah. I haven't gone to the library yet.
Yeah, me either. Now, Jesse, you're originally from Alaska, right?
Yes, I was born in Alaska, but Matt and I met, like you said, in college, where we both went to Western Washington University. I was there studying fine arts, I, as a young person, knew that I was destined to be an artist.
Yeah.
And so I was on a path to become an artist, and I crossed paths with Matthew and other friends that we made from Washington, a group of folks that he grew up with in Eastern Washington, and that was about 20 years ago. And Matt and I have been engaged in these vigorous discussions about what the future ought to look like for a couple decades now, but in the way that you do as adult friends, right? Which is every few months, 3 or 4 months or 6 months that we see each other, it's like, we should do this more often.
Yeah.
So
that's basically how the podcast got started.
It's just basically we'd go to a concert, a show, just to get together, and I had a busy life with kids and family, and we'd get together and we'd have these explosive conversations, right? And people would come over, like at Denny's or wherever place we're eating, and so they'd come in on the conversation because we were talking about deep core issues that people don't broach.
Yeah.
And so much of life is about small talk.
Yeah.
But small talk kind of blocks out those deep system discussions. So we were thinking, this is weird that people are like joining our conversation, and we kept saying, well, this would be great, because we were talking about podcasts, and podcasts were starting to emerge in the late 2000s, and so it was something that was on the discussion point for us, I think.
Well, that's cool. Well, going a little bit further back, let's say, because I know that, there's an appeal, there's a nerd culture, you know what I mean? And that's often how we find each other, initially when we're younger.
I played D&D.
You do that. Didn't you have comic books? And I actually brought a few comic books with me here.
That's how I learned to read, actually. I learned to read.
Can you believe this is actually a Tesla comic book?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and can you believe that?
It's a pop culture.
And this is when I was a media ambassador for UN program, and they made this great, they worked with, was it Marvel? I guess it is? DC. No, they worked with DC to create this comic book with Superman and Wonder Woman about landmines. It's really a really good educational
what I find
about
comic books too is like it's especially with TV culture it allows for literacy because there's a visual element. So I actually was in remedial reading classes up until 4th grade, and comic books is actually how I learned how to read. So my worst subject as an elementary kid was actually reading, which is ironic because I have a PhD in English. But
Wow.
I had struggled with reading through my childhood.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me.
No,
at all.
when parents ask me, it's like, because I know I'm an English teacher, I'll say, well, look, try this, because this is a broken down film, essentially.
Right.
And so it works really well for reading. And so, yeah, I played D&D and was involved in nerd culture, and then I felt comfortable when I started working for the high school newspaper. I went to a school called Kamaikan High School, and we had a newspaper there, and that's where I really felt rooted into kind of a beautiful nerd culture.
So did you find discover these ideas through film, through TV, through music, through books, Jesse? Or what?
Well, I think it wasn't so much nerd culture that brought the two of us together in our collaborations with this project and previous projects while we were at university. It was more art culture. He's a writer and I'm a visual artist, and we were running in the same circles and working on similar projects, and you actually collaborated with a few of our fellow art student comrades.
I did performance art for some friends at Western Washington, and we had something called Umpopta, which is like pop and Dadaism, and we had this art project. We wanted to take over the campus with this kind of emergent art project, and that was my friend Chris's idea of how to create community. But also I think when we moved from, let's say, like comic books to like a novel or deep modern art, you're engaged on a symbolic level in a much richer way than you were with comic books, where you're mostly going for entertainment and narrative. When I was getting my degree in English, it was actually through a writing concentration in poetry and fiction. So you're actually seeing how things are built.
Yes.
So seeing how narratives are built is what allows you to think and make that transition towards political transformation.
Yeah, and I know for myself personally, it was like, books like 1984 or Tolfer's The Future Shock.
Yeah, that Future Shock.
Yeah, those books that, and then of course, being a fan of Star Trek. And so and then and music, like David Bowie, Space Oddity, or
Oh, and Fahrenheit 9/11 was huge for me. I don't know. I'm sorry, not Fahrenheit 9/11, but actually Fahrenheit 451 was really big because that was where science fiction was starting to be taught at high schools, for the first time.
That's true.
Definitely Star Trek. I think we talk about this too. It comes up a lot when we talk about visions for the future. And when we talk about what a future could look like, I think Star Trek culturally is a real key touchstone for us broadly to imagining what the future might look like in a more egalitarian way.
Yes.
Because the future that the Star Trek narrative inhabits is really a communist future, right?
That's true.
It's a post-scarcity world.
That's right.
And it is one where technology has been embraced. There are replicators, so we don't have to go and make all our own food and stuff. So but they've moved beyond money systems. So
that's right.
For me, the next generation, so Jean-Luc Picard and the whole cast of The Next Generation, that was something that was a ritual thing every Saturday night in the late 90s as a teenager.
It's really the biggest manifestation we have in pop culture of utopia.
That's right.
But the really funny, interesting implication in this is that we never see Earth. We don't see what utopia looks like. We actually have to go onto a spaceship where we can have multiculturalism and interracial kissing. But that we actually never know actually fully how the Federation functions as a system much on the first initial show. And so that shows the degree of how hard it is that we literally have to get on a spaceship to actually have communism, because we never see, Earth. Like it's talked about in almost mythological sense. Well, so that's the interesting thing about it being still the most utopian work of art that we have, but it also shows some kinds of limitations.
Well, also in the television series, I think one of the my favorite episode, I think, ended up getting sampled for in a song by a group called Information Society, Pure Energy. What's the name of that song?
I can't remember.
I know which one you're talking about.
the something, the enemy within was the name of the episode, and I remember listening to that song like, why do I know that's Leonard Nimoy saying pure energy? And I'm going like, that's from that episode, my favorite episode. And you hear several others too, several other samples in it. You know, what's on my mind? Which I always see every time I look at Facebook. It's on what's on your mind. You know, so it's nerd. I'm a big time nerd.
But you know, I think what's interesting too is like that Star Wars became the dominant media empire for science fiction, and that shows that we want this good versus evil that's both a narrative strategy but also doesn't offer any solutions. Whereas Star Trek, you know, problems have mostly been solved, or you see problems being solved on the episodes. And so that speaks to the dystopian impulse that we see now, post-World War II and onward, just dystopian kind of literature, where we always need a battle again versus forces of evil and good. Whereas Star Trek implies, I think, by its very narrative trajectory, that we've solved problems on Earth, and now we're going to solve problems elsewhere.
That's right, and that we're actually moving on. We're an existing race of people that's not broken down by color and by gender and by anything. I mean, we're just our goal is literally more focused on, like you say, an egalitarian perspective.
And about exploring, about discovery.
Strange new worlds.
Exactly.
Right?
About what humans actually
could become.
That's right. That's right.
But I mean, even still, it does use as the framework this good versus evil a lot. So it falls into some of the same traps that the Star Wars universe does, and especially the newer films become much more just a bunch of CGI.
I know.
Well, I think that's the interesting thing is the Star Trek films. Essentially, the new ones are basically Star Wars light. I mean, they're based on CGI, and the marketing tools are, we've got to do what you can't do on TV in order to get people in the movie theater, and that's why CGI's taken over as the real spectacle for TV.
There was because we're going to move on to a segment here, and then that you haven't seen, so we can all comment on it. But I wanted to make one more comment about Star Trek. Gene Roddenberry also, as you know, did a TV movie called The Quester Tapes.
Oh, yeah.
And I just discovered the other day that one of our guests on Nowman show was actually in that movie, Mike Farrell. And it's about, and Roddenberry talked about the making of that film, and he said that the executives said, why would you want to make a movie about a character that's looking for his reason for existence? Seriously, this was their discussion in the boardroom.
It's hilarious because that was basically the plot for most 1970s New Hollywood films.
Right?
Was the lonely man.
It's only like potentially the most human of things to think
about. I know, but seriously.
Why are we here? What is this all about?
I heard that interview once and I was like, wow, that was my wake-up call maybe to Hollywood. But right now I'm going to show you a clip. This is from Politicon last year. Of course, we've covered Politicon several years now here on the Nowman Show. This is comedian John Fugelsang. We're not talking about anything funny right now. In this particular segment, I'm calling it Confronting Hatred and the Golden Rule. This is John Fugelsang from Politicon.
You know, some of the most serious people I've ever met in my life, including yourself, are comedians. And I totally understand why that is, because your George Carlin used to talk about that, you know, because it's frustrating to get through life, you know, without having some kind of relief or some kind of therapy.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, for something like hate, what's stronger than ridicule? Well, guns, I guess. But for me, comedians are the best equipped to show the absurdity of hate and to show how hate makes you stupid.
You know, one of the panelists made a comment about there's no hater problem. It's a passport problem, and and I've noticed that myself. That by living overseas, it actually broadened my perspective of what the world is about and all the different kinds of people in it. And the people that I knew that didn't travel so much had a much different view. What's your take on that?
That's kind of similar to something Mark Twain once said, and I do think that. Travel and exposing yourself to people different from yourself is the greatest antidote to hate and stupidity.
I mentioned last year, I also am a preacher's kid and grew up in an environment where there was a lot of these expectations about what reality was based on a book and a belief system, essentially, which is really not a whole lot different in some ways than political ideologies. Like if you're basing everything on that, you're not seeing a bigger picture. But
I think there's a lot of truth in the Bible, not necessarily a lot of facts, but there's a lot of truth. And the problem is when you believe that a talking snake is real, but Christ saying love your enemies was just metaphor.
Good point. Because I always felt like that was the most important part of the Bible, and it's amazing to me how some people just they marginalize that, and that to me that's the most important part.
Jesus did reduce the 10 Commandments to 2.
That's right. And if you did follow those 2, then everything else just kind of falls in place,
Yeah, kind of. I mean, the essential message of all the great religions is don't be a dick.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, that's right,
So that sums up religion. Don't be a dick.
Or the supposed idea of it. Right?
Yeah, right.
But we'll go
exactly.
to these to kind of figure things out. And in some ways, I had a scholar had said that aliens are a metaphor for God.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's a really thoughtful thing to think about. Well, our exploration of aliens has a lot to do with a way of shaking out what we think God might be. If there is one, that's what other manifestation do we have? And those anxieties about the inability to imagine alien life, which often looks humanoid, and the inability to imagine what if there was a God or is a God, what that looks like is part of that grappling point.
Yeah, I know. And dealing with, right now, obviously, we see growing fascism in our world right now because of the, we can get into that in much more detail going on even into the next segment. But it's obvious that there's, the economic downturn has a lot of impact on people. And even though these are not new issues, it brings it out more because people are frustrated with their personal situations. That they want to put food on the table, they want to, be able to pay their bills or whatever, and it just plays into that problem. What are your thoughts?
Well, the I think in many cases the racial scapegoating is easier to pull in as a narrative when solving with solutions is so hard, and there's so few solutions being offered by the left, at least in a visible sense, that we're allowing the motive for racial scapegoating to accelerate. So when people make comparisons to the Weimar Republic and to Hitler and the rise of the Third Reich, there's some reason we can make those analogies. Because racial scapegoating is a mechanism that happens when capitalism is not working for people and it's getting worse every day. And it allows for a really easy answer when people desire certainty. The first episode of our podcast is called The Desire for Certainty, which is an exploration on religion. But the desire for certainty is a profound desire humans have at a core being, is wanting to understand from curiosity what the world should look like. So that desire for certainty is not just a question of religion, but also, I think, a question of economics. Like, I need something certain in my life. At least if I blame immigrants and folks of color, that provides certainty even if it's not true.
That's right, and it becomes more complicated. I mean, distractions, when they're actually based on real things, it makes the situation much more complicated. You know what I mean? And that's I think what's happened in this culture. We really have to get to the nitty gritty.
Yeah, and this personal experiences with religion are part of what has given shape to our conversations, the conversations that Matt and I have had over the years, and that has served as the basis for this new podcast project. And like you said, the first episode talks about these, and we reflect in that episode on our own personal experiences with religion, and then move into tying how those frameworks for explaining the unexplained parts of the universe and of our world and our experience therein are indicative of newer frameworks of oppression and of idol worship that we see in the systems of capitalism and heightened by the neoliberal version of capitalism, and that are creating a confusing world that we all live in, where we're not dealing with real human issues, because and we were talking about this before this discussion, how other countries, the Nordic countries, are having debates about the particularities of homeschooling, or in the UK this year having debates about parking fees for their national health
for
system.
universal health care,
Yeah.
where they're essentially gluing the parking meters, because not only do they not have to worry about co-pays or deductibles, but they also they're gluing the meters so that they can have free parking for the disabled and elderly,
Right.
because it's inhibiting them from getting health care. That's a debate that I wish we were having in this country.
That's right.
But
Because of the social safety nets, that's the
Right.
term it's used here.
Right.
You know, and it's also called welfare.
Right.
When welfare, doesn't
everybody want welfare? I mean,
Yeah.
Don't we all want welfare?
Like,
I mean,
what do you call bailing out banks and corporate subsidies?
Yeah.
Or you know what I mean? Why isn't that called welfare in this country?
Well, it's what Noam Chomsky says: socialism for the rich, privatization for the poor.
That's right.
And that's
or
essentially
rugged capitalism.
Oh yeah, rugged individualism. Yeah, you pull yourself out of the bootstraps, but my kids, they got bootstraps everywhere. They're all over the house, in bank accounts and everything. So yeah, absolutely. So this idea of welfare should be a foundational aspect of being human and loving each other. That's what the phrase we come up with as an idea shape is called the golden square, which is
What is that?
Well, the golden square involves this notion that we should have guaranteed rights. Now, this is different than saying access, right?
So you're not talking about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
We're talking about our notions of the baseline foundations for a just society. So that there should be guaranteed rights for, food, for shelter, for education, and healthcare, right? And those four things should be rights that everyone has in an egalitarian sense.
Right.
That shouldn't be cordoned off.
Yeah.
That we start from this point, right?
Yeah.
Because in a hunter-gatherer society, a mixtape of the past, you were guaranteed the best you could get from that society.
Yeah.
And we've moved away from that. And so you had guaranteed access, for instance, to shaman. It wasn't particularly good medicine, but everyone in that tribal community had access to the same shaman. Suddenly, in the United States, we don't have the right to the shaman. That's absurd in a hunter-gatherer society.
I know, right?
So that's a mixtape we need to bring back in, right? We
Yeah.
need to have the shaman back in our communities.
And our arguments are that these four things are the most essential of human rights. And these four things can create the cornerstones of a more just world. That what we experience now as the illusion of freedom, as the veneer of democracy, under the oppressive forces of capitalism and clearly this week of hate, right? That these four things are necessary for anybody to be free. And if we want to talk about emancipatory movements and about how we build a world, how we build a future, how we create a mixtape with love and care and compassion and empathy for each other, that we need to put these as a foundational set of principles upon which we build that future.
And we're not saying that this is utopia, that we have these four things, but we're saying this is a foundational element to move toward utopia, to move toward post-capitalism. And if you look at the 7 of 10 happiest places on Earth, they're all in the Nordic region, or Greater Scandinavia, as I call it. And they've come really close to all four of these things. And in some states, countries, they provide all of these to a 90% degree.
Yeah.
And so there's no surprise that Scandinavia continues to be ranked in the top 10, several of the countries, because they hit these four things. They're not perfect societies. They're not utopias.
There's no
but they
such
hit these
thing
four
as a
things.
perfect society,
Yeah.
but
Well, I think the desire for perfectibility is something we should try to use as an aiming device.
Yes.
But the fact that they hit these four things is endemic of what's wrong with the United States.
Absolutely. And the last I saw, we were number 1 in 2 areas. Can you guess what those
I
are?
want to say beef production. Is that one
No.
beef?
Violence
Violence, yes,
and military budget.
yes.
Yeah.
Of course, we're number one military budget by far.
So $600 billion. So to give you an idea of that, we could have universal education in the United States with the current expenditures of just $60 billion. So
right.
$60 billion
right.
would give you universal free tuition.
Free tuition, yes.
That's
So
right.
that's, look at the math, 600 versus 60. So we obviously have a messed up alignment in our system.
I know we have so many problems that we spend time talking about identifying what the problems are, and I when we get into the next segment, I want to do that, but I want to focus on the solutions.
Yeah.
And so in the next segment that we do, I want to talk about what is the world that we want to see, and I think that it's becoming clearer and clearer all the time. As Richard Wolff even is saying very clearly, we have to make a decision. All this, it's comfortable in the center, but the center is what drives, populists to the extremes, because nothing gets done, right? So as he identifies it, we have to decide: are we going to go with the right-wing solutions, or are we going to go with the left-wing solutions? And we need to start taking this conversation in those directions.
Or as Buckminster Fuller put
Yes.
it, it's utopia or oblivion. Or as the Democratic Socialists of America would put it, it's socialism or barbarism.
And
This is
from
That's right.
Rosa,
That's
from,
good.
from Rosa
Choice.
Luxemburg, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
that's
Yeah.
from Rosa Luxemburg. And I think that the important thing to think is that actually when we talk about radical, we should talk about the center as the radical space, because they're clearly the most delusional segment of the U.S. population. And
probably the biggest.
they're blocking a real discussion of that right-left
That's
pole
right.
of discussion.
That's right.
Where we can have that. I mean, imagine if we had Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders on the stage.
Right.
You would never have seen such a battle of the 1% versus the 99% than that debate. And we didn't have it. We weren't
We didn't
allowed
get a chance to get
because
that.
it had to have the radical center as part of that project. And maybe the delusional center is a better term, because they're trying to buy time and it's not working. If you look at Macron in France, he's plummeted in the polling, and he's clearly unpopular, and he's not going to be able to keep the French society together.
That's right. That's right. And Theresa May also the same sort of deal, which I want to talk about in the next segment too, and the Labour Party and the democratizing the economy, and there's a lot of cool stuff. And how can we make that happen?
Yes.
You were talking about the dichotomy. Yanis Varoufakis have a quote, but I can paraphrase him, and he said, "We're at a point where we have to make a decision. Are we going to be subject to being the slaves to the owners of the machines, or are we going to insist that we live in a world that is like Star Trek?"
Yeah.
He literally made that reference.
I mean,
we are at that point where we really, as a race, as a human race, not as a country, but as a whole planet, have to decide, what do we want here?
Space communism, please.
Yes, and the other thing is he mentions, and that on Doug Henwood's Behind the News, is that you have the Matrix or Star Trek. Now I would say we still have the Mad Max in play. I mean, we do with climate change
we do.
and nuclear warfare. We have Mad Max. It's always there as that third narrative. But certainly Star Trek and Matrix, with some controls on climate change and nuclear warfare to prevent those. That binary does work, but I don't want to rule out Mad Max. I mean, we have to bring that as part of the
That's true.
discussion.
I did like the soundtrack of that movie, though. It was actually, real quick, it was done by one of the authors of this book, which, by the way, Bang, The Complete History of the Universe, Brian May. That's Dr. Brian May, guitarist of Queen, everybody, who I would love to get on this show. He did the music for the Road Warrior movies, you know that.
It's fantastic.
Well, let's wrap this up, gentlemen. Quickly, I want to say thank you very much for
thanks for having us.
for being on the Nowman show, and
Absolutely.
it will be continued with a panel discussion. We'll bring in the Nowman show heir to media political analyst, Professor George Callis, and we'll continue this discussion. So, Matt Snyder, Jesse Herring, thank you very much for being on the Nowman show. This is Niswander.